Hi, Keith Scott-Mumby here, and I'd like to introduce you to one of my important ebooks, one of the major reports that I produced in recent months. It's called the Candida and Yeast Superhighway, and in that I discussed the topic of what I called the moldy patient. This was a term I invented in the 1980s. Look, I was a pioneer in this field. I was around at the time when Orion Truss, an American doctor, produced a very seminal series of papers about what he called the missing diagnosis, and this was Candida. It was published in the Journal of Orthomolecular Psychiatry, and he was making this very important point that people often get considerably deranged mentally, as well as physically run down because of this problem of Candida, and there were all sorts of strange diagnoses being given for these people, but the real diagnosis was being missed, which was that they had Candida. They had problems with yeast. And I found, I dived in, and pretty soon I learned more than Orion Truss taught me. I found this phenomenon that I call the moldy patient. This is a person who has trouble with yeast. They have trouble with molds. They often have thrush. They may have athlete's foot, jock itch. If it's women, they have a big problem with vaginal thrush. Sometimes there's oral thrush and so on. Often a history of taking a lot of antibiotics, but not necessarily. One of the origins of this problem isn't so much the antibiotics as the crummy modern diets that we have, full of vitiated and denatured manufactured food, full of junk in other words, often sweetened, and sugar is the big enemy here. These kind of organisms, the molds, yeasts, Candida type organisms, love to ferment things. They can take sugar and break it down into alcohols. That was part of the health problems a Candida patient was having. I found that they were often quite literally drunk. They were spaced out on alcohol and alcohol-like chemicals that were being produced by these fermenting organisms in the bowel. Well, I did a lot of research and I found that it wasn't just as simple as Candida. In fact, there are a number of special organisms that could qualify for this. You find this story, you see, in the medical literature. It's been appearing and reappearing and disappearing actually over many years. About every 30 years or so, the Candida story surfaces again. I found references to it way back in 1911 in the medical literature, but then nobody could really figure it out or explain it. This was before antibiotics, remember, and yet it was around. It surfaced again in the 30s as intestinal carbohydrate fermentation syndrome. And again, there was a problem with it. They couldn't work out causes or treatments, and so it tended to relapse. It probably would have stuck around, except that in the 50s and 60s, there emerged this idea of psychosomatic medicine, and that took over in a lot of ways, I'm sorry to say. So a lot of people who were really physically ill, like they had Candida or yeast infections, were just simply passed off as neurotic, and their problems were psychological. All their imagined illnesses were psychosomatic. That did a lot of damage. Anyway, as I say, things changed in the 1979 when Orion Truss published the first of this series of papers, and we've been very aware of this ever since. And I'd like to say that I've got a lot of special knowledge in this field. I've been at it for years. I've prepared this major comprehensive report for you where I've gone into the orthodox treatments, and there are a lot of very valuable orthodox treatments. Some of them border on toxic, but they have a place. If you're dying of pneumonia, you're not going to say to somebody, hey, listen, I don't want antibiotics, just give me essential oils, or I want some kind of herb. If you're dying of pneumonia, you're going to want to take the orthodox drug, right? And the same situation is true here. If you have severe overload of Candida, you're going to be very sick, and people actually do die. That's rare, but a person can become so overwhelmed that they need some kind of special heavyweight treatment, as it were. But I've also gone into all the alternative things, of course, the herbal remedies. There are many, many things that you can do, are much safer and much gentler. And of course, the number one thing that you can do is change your diet for the better. Now, you don't need to follow these completely extreme and stupid diets that I see published on the web. They might be all right for a short 1 or 2 weeks test diet, but the idea of keeping somebody on these diets as a health treatment is crazy. And I've seen people made very, very sick who had Candida. They'd gone to see alternative practitioners. They were given nonsense advice. They were losing, 20, 30 pounds, which they could ill afford to lose. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And I've tried to correct this misinformation I put it all in this report. As I said, I've called it the Candida and Yeast Superhighway, kind of an information superhighway. Very important book, very important part of your own personal armamentarianism. And it's a very, it's an important gap to fill in your knowledge. Make sure that you're very knowledgeable about this. It's something that no one can be afford to be ignorant of. We're all up against yeasts. It's in our food, not just the bread and alcohol where we're swallowing these, but then the carbohydrate foods feed these and enable them to ferment and live and multiply in the gut. But it's in lots of other foods too, things like fruit juice and, manufactured foods and these things. They're never fresh. So mold is an ever-present enemy, and we need to know what to do to beat that. You need to be armed, and again, as I said, knowledge is the best armory that you have. I'm always saying this. You need to know. You need to know what you're up against, and then you can deal with it. That's why I prepared this report for you. Okay? Thank you.